sort of using a web service, although it's called a web server. So if you open duckduckgo.com, what you're actually doing is sending a GET request to duckduckgo.com and getting an HTML page back, which will show you DuckDuckGo. And DuckDuckGo actually is a nice privacy-friendly Google. So if you want to step out of the Google search bubble, you can use DuckDuckGo. Can be useful as a developer as well, because as a developer, you tend to get into a search bubble with Google that sort of shows you what you expect instead of what's real. So if you really believe that Delphi is the greatest software development tool on earth, then Google will sort of follow you in that. And obviously DuckDuckGo will confirm that because Delphi is the greatest development tool on earth. Well, that's what I think. So you feel free to think otherwise, obviously. Okay, so if you're using a web service, the GET request will be slightly different, but it's still basically the same. It's just a HTTP request to a web service. In this case, for instance, the DuckDuckGo API, where you can ask a question and you'll get a result back, in this case, in a JSON structure. Let's do both in a browser. So let's go to the browser and let's try this one here. Yeah, we'll allow that. So this is basically what happens. We send a GET request to DuckDuckGo and we get HTML page back. You can actually see the HTML with Ctrl+Shift+I. You can start the debugger of your web browser. You can see the HTML code here with the image and the header and all that stuff. Okay. So if you want to use that as a web service, well, DuckDuckGo also has a web service, the API.duckduckgo here. And I'll just copy it from a different location because it's kind of mangled here. And just go there. And it's just a web address with a query with parameters. And that will get you a JSON result where you can actually use JSON as a backend of your application to search information, for instance, on Blaise Pascal. And this source, the actual source for the information here is Wikipedia. And you'll get some information that Blaise is actually a long river, as well as a tributary. And of course, it's also a magazine. But there's also Blaise High School. I'm not sure if someone here is from the Blaise High School. That would be quite a coincidence. But then you'll be living in Bristol, England. Okay, so that's that. And there are a number of basic concepts that you need to know before you can actually use web services as well as create web services. You'll need to know a little bit about how a URL works. You'll need to know a little bit about how this format works, and you'll need to know a little bit about web service and web services itself. It's all pretty straightforward. It's not that difficult to actually learn how to create a web service, and it's even easier how to learn to consume a web service, use a web service. That's even simpler. Some basic stuff, URL, URI, as well as HTTP. Let's start with a URL. URL is the Uniform Resource Locator. So that's the https://duckduckgo.com here. This is the Uniform Resource Locator. And that's just a human readable address. And if you're familiar with network technology, with TCP/IP, you know that this address is actually translated through DNS, the domain name system, into an IP address. And the IP address is the actual physical address of this server. Well, in analogies, if you don't really know what the network stack is and all that stuff, you don't really have to know. The URL is just the home address for the house where your resource lives. So it's the home address, in this case, of the DuckDuckGo search engine. So you need to know that address, but you don't actually have to know all the inner workings of it. You're fine if you just ignore it and just see it as a HTTP address. Then there's another thing, it's called a URI. So this is an L here, and this is an I. That's the Uniform Resource Identifier. And that's just a sublocation within the URL. So if you go to the DuckDuckGo page, you can go to the index page here. and that's a subpage within DuckDuckGo. That's actually a URI. And mostly the web services that you'll be using will have a URI. So you'll have a basic address like google.com, duckduckgo.com, and you'll have some slashes after that and specific location for your resource. And that's a uniform resource identifier. So if I'm talking about a URL, it's just an address. If I'm talking about a URI, it's a sub-address. So it's a specific bookcase, for instance, inside the house, or a specific room inside the house, if you will. Another thing that we'll be using is HTTP. And HTTP is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Well, HTTP is actually the language of the web. Everything you do online uses HTTP. In analogies, HTTP is just a very limited language used to exchange data. It only has 9 words. I've listed them on the right-hand side here. So you've got get, head, post, put, delete, connect, options, trace, and patch, where get gets you data, and head just tries to connect to a location and just gets the header. And post and put allows you to change data. Delete allows you to remove data. Connect is a connection to a location. With options, you can set some options on the location, and there's also trace and patch. Patch is sort of like an update, and trace allows you to trace. You can sort of read more details on that in Wikipedia. Wikipedia is actually quite a good source for all kinds of information. It's not 100% reliable, so if you really want to go into the lower details, you will have to open the RFC document here. And again, this is, oh, this one's been superseded. This one's actually in your handout, so you can just use it from there. You don't have to write things down. So if you want to, you can read through this, but this is kind of terse and kind of a lot of information. But if you want to continue with using HTTP, it's a good thing. It's a good place to start. But actually, all the information that you really need is probably on this HTTP page, where you can have all the 9 commands here as well. And then you have the RFC document if you want to drill down in the HTTP page from Wikipedia itself. So you'll be fine. Okay, so you now know some of the things that you need to know, some basic web service knowledge, and why you want to write a web service. And we'll get into your own web service later on. So first I want to create a web service client. So we'll start with a simple web service client, and we'll do that with Delphi. So just minimize this, and we'll go to Delphi. So what we'll be doing is creating a minimal web service client. And that web service client is going to use the NET request. I'll just save that here. The code that I'm going to create is also in the handout as well as in the zip file. So you can just download it and use that. Or if you want to, you can actually follow while I'm coding it. So I'll be doing it slowly. I won't go full speed, hopefully. So I'll just create a folder here, which is the web service client folder. A web service client folder. I've created a new project, new VCL application. I could have created a new FireMonkey application that would have been cross-platform, but I'm still using Windows here, so using a VCL application is just fine. If you want to go cross-platform, you could have used a FireMonkey application. First, I'm going to save everything. So this one's going to be unit form main, and this is just a main form. And I'm going to save the project file as web server client. Save that. So this is just file, new VCL application, and then saving everything down. Actually, I can just run this. As you may have seen in earlier sessions, this is just a functional application that already works. And if you want to, you can see where the executable is headed. If you right-click in the project manager and then show an explorer, you'll see that you have a Win32 directory. And in that Win30 directory is actually an executable. You can just give this executable to an end user and he'd be able to use it. He'll probably complain that it's pretty empty, so there's no functionality in there. So let's fix that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a panel and use the panel to align stuff on the top of the screen. So I'm just going to align this panel at the top of the screen. And in this panel, I will place a button as well as a edit. So I'm going to use a panel with an edit and a button. I'm going to right align the button here. So it's on the right hand side. And then I'm going to client align with the align property here, the edit. And then I'm going to also increase the font so you can more clearly see what I'm doing. The source code font has already been increased, but it's good to have this form in a larger font as well. So I'm going to the font property of the form. And in the font property of the form, I will use a larger form. 14. Yeah, that should work. Usually Delphi actually starts with Tahoma, and it's a good default font for the older days. I tend to use Segu UI for a more modern look. Look a bit nicer. Okay, so now we have a button and edit. The edit, I'm going to rename the edit to edit URL. And I'm going to rename the button to button get. I tend to use the name that's already there and just replace the 1, 2, or 3 that Delphi adds. So you have a button get. And the button get is actually a get button. So the text for that button or the caption will be get. Like that. Okay, so I'm going to get some data from a URL. I can actually add some text to this one here, so that you get an indication of what it's doing. So let's just go there and just type in a URL. Blaise Pascal Magazine EU, actually it's European. Okay. Now I'm going to add a memo for some feedback, because I'm going to use this URL to get to this web service at Blaise Pascal Magazine, which is actually a web server. And I'm going to display the result in a memo. And that memo, I'll call that memo result. So let's change the name here. Memo result and align client. Almost looks like an application. Let's rename this memo to memo response. Actually, that's a better name for what I'm going to do with that, because I'm going to add the response to that. Okay. Now all I need to do is create some code to actually request this data from the HTTP URL and feed the memo response with the reply, which will be an HTML page. For that, I need to add two components, the net HTTP client as well as net HTTP request. Net HTTP client is actually the connection, and the net HTTP request will be the single request to this URL. Let's rename net HTTP client to net HTTP client itself without the 1, and this one will be also without the 1. Now the net HTTP client will be used by the net HTTP request. So what I'm going to do is connect these two. Now you'd think that would be a drag and drop, but unfortunately it's not. You have to select net HTTP request and then connect the client to that. So they're now connected. If you're following through with this code, which is fine, you can just follow through what I'm doing. Keep in mind that the handout actually has the same instructions. So if you look in the handout, I think on page 4, you'll see what I'm currently doing, because I'm just following the handout. Although I'm obviously explaining it a bit more than it's available in the handout. Okay, so a net HTTP request and a client. Next thing I have to do is actually use these to request data from this URL. So what I'm going to do is add a on-click event handler on the button. I can do that with a double click, or I can go to events and double click here in the on-click. For now, I'm just going to double click here, and you'll see that there's actually a button click now here. So the button get click, what I'm going to do is write some code. So I'm going to use the net HTTP request, and I'm going to set the method string to get. You may remember that get is actually one of the 9 HTTP commands. So it's here. I'm going to use get as the first request. What am I going to request? Well, I'm going to request the URL for the net HTTP request. And the URL I'm going to request is the URL in the edit. There's an edit on screen, which is edit URL. And that edit has a text property. And the text property is what actually contains this URL. Next up, I'm going to execute that HTTP request, having it actually go online and request the data. Like that. Now, the net HTTP request, by default, it's called synchronously. So there is a synchronous method here. But I really would like to have that to be asynchronous. Oh, sorry, it's here. If you use asynchronous, that means that the user interface will not be paused while it's getting data. So it's probably better to put this on asynchronous. Otherwise, the user interface will freeze for a bit. Okay, so but that does mean that after the GET request, it's not immediately feeding back data. So what I need to do is, if the request is completed, then I want to display the data in the memo response. So I need on request completed. I'm going to fill the memo response, and that's the text property as well, with the A response content as string. So this request here, it will execute, it will go online, it will get to the HTML page, and you get the HTML page back in a response. Okay, let's try this. Just save it, run it. And we'll try with Blaise Pascal Magazine. And that actually works. You can see that it's an HTML page here. Obviously, I can also go to DuckDuckGo. And get the data from there. It thinks I'm IE mobile, maybe. It's handheld friendly. Okay, that's good to know. The HTML page here, it's sort of the same as what you'll see if you go to DuckDuckGo and in your browser, and with Ctrl-Shift-I, you go to the inspector. You'll see here, if IE mobile 7, that's actually the same text here, if IE mobile 7. So what you're seeing here is a text representation of the HTML page for DuckDuckGo. Now maybe this is a good point to actually look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Let me see here.
So one question about if you're going to get into security. I pointed to the handout and said that you mentioned some of the basics in there, but here's another question. Can we just use HTTP client for calling services?
Yeah, well, you can. You don't have to. There are a number of other components as well. So you've got the REST connection and REST client connection. There are more. They've got more body and more functionality. But to be honest, I usually use net HTTP request and net HTTP client because the web services are pretty easy to actually use. And regards to security, we are not going to add something like HTTPS with Let's Encrypt certificates, but I will be mentioning security in the last session where we deploy to an actual web server with the ISAPI DLL. So that's kind of like two questions in one.
And the web server will, if the web server has HTTPS, that'll encrypt the traffic going over it, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, if you use HTTP, you're unencrypted. But if you deploy your web service to an ISAPI, to a Windows IIS server, and you install a certificate from Let's Encrypt, which is a free certificate, you can just install that. Your traffic will be encrypted through HTTPS. That's the same if you go to DuckDuckGo here. There's an HTTPS here, and then you get this log. So verified, only verified not by DigiCert, but verified by Let's Encrypt. And you can also go to DigiCert and get a rather expensive certificate if you want to. So that would work as well. But the security
Mark's
or encryption. Yeah.
Sorry? I was going to say Mark's asking to see the pass file again too when you get a second, but
sorry, yeah, sure. Yeah, I can go back to the pass file. So I'll just show the pass file and I'll continue talking about security. So actually this code is also in the handout. So you can just type it in from the handout. So if you download the handout, you'll be able to find this code. If you download the zip file, you will have the code completed as is. So the code I'm going to create today is completed as is in the zip file that I put in the chat. Regarding security, yeah, HTTPS, actually you don't have to do that much in your web service. You will probably want to add some authentication, which is a subject on its own. So maybe you want to use OAuth or something like that. There are some excellent sessions on the Embarcadero site as well for OAuth. But if you want to do basic authentication with just a username password, you can do that in IIS or Apache itself as well. So you'll just have a password or a one-time passcode if you want to. Hopefully that sort of answered some of these questions, but I'll get back to security, encryption, stuff like that in session 4 as well.
Yeah, because there's another question about multi-factor. It says if for developing servers, it'd be good to see implementing security from both sides. Is that scheduled for a later session? I'm not sure what I mean. So are you getting into like user authentication here as well, or? No.
Actually, because of this, it's a summer camp presentation. I'm not going to use OAuth or multi-factor authentication. But I can tell you that if you want to use multi-factor, you're better off using open authentication, OAuth, and just having a third party do that. So people can actually log in through one-time passcodes that are supplied by either Google or Facebook or one of the other OAuth authenticators out there. It's a lot easier than rolling your own authentication, because rolling your own authentication also means that you have to support many multi-factors like text,
yes,
SMS text, and dongles and whatnot. And that's a lot of effort. So rolling your own web service is just fine. Rolling your own authentication, you're probably better off using an external one. That's my 2 cents actually. What are your experiences? What do you think, Jim?
I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, okay. If someone disagreed, please put that in chat and we can talk about that. It's just fine.
So I know you said you're not planning to get into OAuth and stuff like that in this session. Do you think maybe in the future we could schedule another one with you to get into OAuth a little more advanced?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. I've got some code that I've written previously. You can just use. Actually, if you know how OAuth works, it's pretty straightforward. But if you're starting to learn how to code, I wouldn't start necessarily with reading about OAuth, because it's kind of convoluted the way it's described. So it's almost like the OAuth explanatory documents are meant to confuse people. I'm not sure that's their actual what they actually want to achieve, but to me, it's kind of they make it more complicated than it actually is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That it seems complicated from the outside, but then once you understand the basics of REST and stuff like that, it's like, oh, this is not that big a deal.
No, and then you write the code once, and you'll just copy that over like a gazillion times and just reuse it. Yeah. Okay. I'll continue with the presentation because we're going to create a web service as well, and I want to be able to actually finish that web service. It's not that big a deal either. So we've just finished a web client, and that web client actually works. We just saw that. So I'll just save that and close that. And then I'll go to some more information on web services. So why web service? Well, it's the central online storage of data, etc., etc. But why would you write your own web service? I just told you that authentication, you wouldn't necessarily write that. You just get someone else to do that for you, like Google, Facebook, or one of the other authenticators out there, like Microsoft or whatever. But there are also web services that you can actually readily use from Microsoft or from Amazon or from other vendors. Why would you want to roll your own web service? Well, obviously it's fun, but it's also quite easy to do. And the benefit of using your own web service is that you can host it yourself. And that means that you get very predictable expenses. And the cost is actually pretty low. So there's some effort involved, which you determine, obviously. But the actual expenses, they can be like $10 or $20 a month for having your web service run online on the internet. And then you have some code that's easy to use, easy to maintain, and there's also a very long support window. So if Amazon or Microsoft decides to change their bucket size or bucket handling or their blob handling or their protocol, you don't actually have to do anything. You'll just continue and smile and use your own web service because that will just continue on working. So that's the long support window. And those are the major benefits of using your own web service. What are the downsides? Azure and the Microsoft solution to actually have better scalability. If you want to do your own scalability, you can do that. You can just use a web garden of Internet Information Services, and that will just work fine as well. But it's a bit more effort. And there's some administration involved. So if you want to know who's logging on and who's using it, there's some administration involved. Actually, there's another product from Embarcadero, which is Red Server. Red Server is based on WebBroker, and that has the administration built in. So if you want detailed administration of who's using your web service, take a look at Red Server as well, because you may not want to write that part. But for the most part, a lot of my customers, they have their own web services. And they're pretty simple and straightforward. So what do they use it for? Well, they use it to store and retrieve some data like PDFs for a report server or like JPEGs for a image server where people download images of damage on their car, for instance, or video files, MP4s, or some binary stuff, or mappings like map information with the location and stuff like that, or just documents. You can also use the web service to supply a customer with online algorithms that you wouldn't be able to run on a certain device. For instance, if you have a handheld device that's limited in processing power, you can actually use the speech. Actually, the Translate IT service from Microsoft, that's one of those examples where the speech is actually converted into text, and that's a web service as well. So you can use that as a web service. Or just video encoding, looking for faces in videos. Facebook has a web service that does that, or looking for faces in images. some supercomputing, some AI. Google has Google AI that you can use. But you can also write this yourself. And that's the nice thing about it. So you can design something and then make sure that people are able to use that as a web service. Now we're using the web service framework called WebBroker, which is Delphi WebBroker framework, which is here. There's a lot of information on that in the doc wiki itself. But you could also use some other open source web service frameworks like Mars or Mormat or Whirl. Those are all fine. I mean, they're very good frameworks. I'm using Delphi WebBroker just to explain to you how this works. And to be honest, for most use cases, just using a WebBroker framework will do just fine. Unless you're creating larger software with a lot of users, then you'd probably want to look into Mormat or Mars or Whirl, depending on your use case. Does that mean that the WebBroker framework is limited? No, I'm actually using the WebBroker framework in one location where there are 2,500 users. And they're using the web servers within a 4-hour period. So there's a lot of concurrent users there. So it's not limited in performance or anything like that. If you want to go up to 10,000 or 1 million users, you won't even get this running on Mars, Curiosity, or Mormat, and then you actually have to either go scale up with a web garden farm of servers with WebBroker or Mars or Mormat, or you have to move out to the immensely large web farms for like Azure or the Microsoft version or the Amazon version. So that depends on your usage, actually. Okay, so let's just take a look at how you create such a web service. So how hard is it to create your own web service? And you'll see that it's surprisingly easy. That's probably because, well, Delphi makes it easy. So in the Delphi 10.4.2 Community Edition, you actually have the option to create your own web service with the WebBroker. And it's on New and Other. And then it's under Web, and then Web Server Application. It should be there. As you can see, I also have Data Snap and stuff and Red Server here, but that's because I'm running a Enterprise Edition. But the Delphi 10.4.2 Community Edition actually has a web server application. If you choose web server application, you can choose the platform. We're going to use target platform Windows here, but you can also target Linux at a later point in time. I'm going to use a standalone GUI application because I want to debug it, but the standalone GUI application is not meant for deployment, it's just for development. Later on, I'm going to change that to Izapi Dynamic Link Library. I'll be doing that in day 4. When we deploy to an actual web server. Next, I'm going to use VCL application, that's fine. I'm going to port 8080 for HTTP protocol and just test it if it's available. Yeah, it is available, so that's fine. Do not click HTTPS here. If you want to, you can actually add certificates locally and use that, but that's a lot of work. Actually, it's a lot easier to just use Izapi and embed your certificates in IIS, or use Apache and embed your certificates there. So it's a lot easier to do HTTPS with a Apache or IIS, Internet Information Services server. So you don't want to use HTTPS here. Okay, finish. It's going to create a project for me. And this is the project. I'm going to save that project. Save all in the summer camp demo directory. And I'm going to create a new directory for that, which is the web service server. Okay. The web service server has a form unit, it has a web model unit, and it has a project, and the project will be renamed to web service server. Okay. Now I have a web service server here, and that actually works. I can just run this and then start it. And if you start it, you will get a security alert for Windows Defender Firewall. I'll just allow the web service server to work on private networks as well and public networks. For some reason, it's reversed on my end here. So you probably want to disable this and allow that instead of doing it like that. I'm going to just allow both because I don't really remember what I've set it to, if it's private or public, I'm not sure. If you're currently running this session and you're on an airport, please don't enable public networks, but just a private one. Okay, so for me, it's both, so it's fine. Allow access. It'll add a firewall rule and will allow my web server service to actually communicate. Now I can open the browser and it'll open the URL to the local host on port 8080. And you'll get a response web server application. And if you look at the HTML code behind that with Ctrl+Shift+I, it's actually just a header web server application with a body web server application. And that's originating from our web server. So just take a look at the web server itself. Where does this come from? Actually, it comes from the web module unit. So if you open the web module unit, use F12 to go to the form, and then go to properties. We'll have some web action items here. So the web module unit has some web action items, and the web action items determine what the web server does for you, what the web service does for you. So if we open that, you get a list of locations, and there's a default handler here. The default handler has path /, so it's on localhost port 8080, and the default path is /. This is actually a URI, but this is a URI that falls back to the URL because it's just the basic location, and we're going to add another URI to that. So the default handler / here, any method, and it's enabled, will call into the default handler, and the default handler will get some HTML content to the browser. So this is, let's call this Summer Camp 2021. And go here in the body and do the same. I say, yeah. Because we just rolled our own web server. Let's run it again. Open the browser. And yeah, it does work. So this is a basic standalone web server that's used for debugging purposes. So I'm going to just close this here and stop that.
There's a couple questions here, Danny.
Sure. Yeah.
One's asking about if you're going to get into server deployment, especially like on Azure or AWS.
Actually, what I do use is virtual private servers. So I do get into deployment on virtual private servers. And the VPS hosting can be done on Amazon, Elastic Cloud, and several other locations. That's because I roll your own web service, you'll host that up probably on a virtual private server with a hosting provider. And I'm not going to use Azure Web Services itself or other web services by Microsoft or Amazon or any of the other providers, because then I wouldn't be creating my own web service. I would be using their web service. And there are a lot of downsides to using their web service. But I'll get into that in session, I think that's session 4.
Yeah, I think it's session 4. And also, can you get into the difference between a data snap, RAD server, and then what you're doing here as far as developing your own with WebBroker, and why you might choose one scenario over the other?
Yeah, sure. Well, what I'm doing here is the base level. So this is actually a very basic web server and web service. And so WebBroker is the foundation of RAD server. RAD server builds on WebBroker and uses WebBroker to actually get you a RESTful web service. So the web service that I'm creating here, RAD server would already have that. So it's easier to use even than using WebBroker. but it does have some licensing cost. Add to that DataSnap, and DataSnap allows you to use WebBroker. So WebBroker is based, its foundation is also in DataSnap. So DataSnap is also based on WebBroker, and DataSnap allows you to easily access database data. So it's DataSnap, so database access in a snap. You can sort of translate it to that. So if you want to expose database data, you can use DataSnap. And it makes it easier to actually update data.
Yeah, exactly. The other question here is, instead of typing the HTML and stuff like that, as you're showing here in response content, is there a way to use either load in HTML files as templates or you reference external HTML files?
Yeah, obviously, yeah, sure. Yeah, you can just load them in with a file. So T file and load from file, load from stream and stuff like that. So you can have HTML files loaded up. But to be honest, you usually will not load HTML files in a web broker application because you're running your web broker on a web server like Apache or Internet Information Server. And Apache and Internet Information Server know how to handle HTML files and get them out to the end user. So the HTML files will usually be placed outside of the web broker application. The web broker application itself will probably be used for web services, for DataSnap, for Red Server, or any other stuff. And you'll probably communicate with JSON or some file IO. Maybe that won't make sense now, but I'll explain that further on as well.
So I do have to hop off and go to another webinar, but you're more than welcome to keep going.
Yeah.
I just won't be on anymore.
No, that's good to know. So I won't be asking you any questions, Jim. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to continue with creating the web service. The web service itself, the web model unit, I'm going to add another URI, Uniform Resource Identifier. So the web module has the web action items, and I'm going to add a URI here. And that URI will be number. So the path will be /number. I will use method type get, and I'm going to enable that. And the actions, I will add some response content. Now I could have just added a response content with an HTML, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to respond with something that's actually valid JSON. It's not that complicated JSON. So just a number, but that just a number actually still works. So what I'm going to feedback here is a response.content. And I'm going to actually create a random number from 0 to 100 and then convert that to a string. And what will happen here is that it will just return something like 42, like that, actually without the quotes. Now we need to know what type of content this is, actually because the browser wants to know what type of content this is. And by default, it's HTML or application JSON. We're going to actually explicitly tell the browser that the content type is application JSON. And you'll see some response that differs from the HTML code in the browser in a moment. So the content type will be application/JSON, which is specified in the RFC documents. And I'm going to use a char set that's UTF-8. Okay, like that. Okay, so the content type is JSON. Char set is UTF-8. UTF-8 is actually the default character set for web interaction. It's more condensed than UTF-16. Okay, so I'm just going to run that and start it and open the browser. SummerCamp, yeah, so that's the HTML file. And if I now go to the sub location, the URI number, you'll see the number 48. You'll see that the browser is actually changing into JSON representation, where the raw data is 48 and the JSON interpretation is 48, because actually just sending a number is a valid JSON format. And in the headers, you'll see that it's a application, XAML, blah, blah, blah. It's going to accept that, but the content type is actually JSON, and the char set is UTF-8, which is what I set as content type and char set. So what do you have here? Here you have your own first actual web service, a web service to create a random number. So I could actually deploy that and use that for a lottery if I wanted to, or you could deploy that and use that for a lottery as well. Or you can just use it as for a random 6, use it as dice or anything like that. That actually sort of works. That's the code that I wanted to do. So this is just basically the code. I'm going to actually get this number not only in the browser, but also in the client that I wrote. For that, I'm going to add the client to the same project group. So I'm going to stop this project here. I'm going to add an existing project. That's the web service client. And so that's on SummerCamp demo web service client here. And open that. And then I'm going to save the project group. I'm going to save that. Okay, so the server here. It's trying to save my server, which, okay, it's fine. Didn't want to do that, but okay, so I'll just close this and save that. Close that. And then just go and then do file save all. And then it'll save the project group. And the project group will be called Web Service Group. So that's it. Okay, so I'm going to run the server. Start it. And then I'm going to use the client that we wrote earlier to request a number from the local host. So just go here. Go to localhost, which is the URL that sort of translates to our own computer, port 8080, and go to number and get it. 27. Now 60, 38, 27, 84, 54. That just works. Okay, so I've got a number of slides left. I'll just go through them and then I'll go into chat. I've got some 5 minutes for a chat left. So there's some HTTP commands in our web service. We're currently only using get, and tomorrow we'll be using post, put, and delete. It's already in your PDF document, so you can use that and as a sort of a preview. And tomorrow we'll actually be using get, put, post, and delete in the HTTP protocol to implement a REST architecture with a JSON result. And to be honest, actually, we already have some of the REST architecture. We have the get, and we have a JSON result with a number. So we're already partly there. Now, don't forget to download the doc, source, and slides, and I'll switch over and I'll go into the chat to see if there are any questions. So let me see here. Actually, it's a very small window. So in the chat here, let me see if there are any questions. So for the attendees, I think I have to change some setting here because I'm not seeing any questions here. The handout doesn't work. For some reason, I'm not getting the questions. I think I have to become a panelist for that. Let me see if I can get that running. Attendees can ask questions and can raise hands. Yeah, so that's enabled. And oh yeah, there it is. Test question, thank you. So that's good. Test question, yeah, that works. Okay, send to all. For some reason, I don't think, because Jim was answering questions, If you have any questions, please ask them again, because I think that the questions that Jim saw can't download the documents. Okay, so you should be able to download this document. If you go to handouts, you'll see the document there in your chat window. The other one will be just to open this link here. So if you go to this location, hey, it's no longer working, which is kind of funny. So why isn't this working here? Oh, so sorry, yeah, I'm on Web Services 1. I was publishing the wrong link. So the one on the Web Services 2, you should go to Web Services 1. So if you go to Web Services 1, which is this one here, I'll just open a notepad and just make it a bit larger, so you can see the link as well. And the link is also in the chat. So I put it in the chat again, just to make sure. So, okay, so I'll send to all the web services link again, but you can just use this link here or the link on the form. Okay, how many parallel requests are you able to fulfill? Well, the web broker can actually handle up to 1,000 parallel requests. It also depends on the size of your web server. So if you have a web server that has 4 CPUs, 1,000 requests per second, transactions per second, should be easily attainable. You do have to code them efficiently, because if you code request response and your own code takes more than a millisecond or 2 to actually get the data out there, you may fill up. But that's more in your code than in the web broker code. So to resume that, it's about 1,000. So about 1,000 per server. So send that to all. And then could you download the zip? Thank you. Clear presentation. Thank you. And the test question. Okay, so I'll just go here. I'm just trying to open that. Oh, okay. So I don't see any new questions, probably because they're in the folder from Jim. Feel free to just post a question tomorrow, because tomorrow between 5 and 6 European time, I'll be back with the second session. We'll be doing the put, post, and delete in our web service. So we'll be adding data to it instead of just requesting data. And since it's 6 o'clock, we have to end now. Thank you for attending the session, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Okay. Thank you all. Bye.